My name is Kay Slater, and I'm a collective member of the Paper Cut Arcade. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, and my practice is very process-based, focused on trying and embracing mistakes and challenging traditional methods of display. For the Posthuman Romantics exhibition, I produced 3 works: Human English Romantic Poetry, the Cosmologist's Portfolio, and Brambles and Spores. Human English Romantic Poetry was a performance piece in the weeks leading up to the exhibition. John had wanted to host some workshops and events that would get people thinking about the concepts and to encourage folks to join us. One of our collective goals is to be really open and encouraging to anyone who wants to try and produce works for our events. I was already working on my concepts for the Cosmologist portfolio, and so my character was being fleshed out when we set our schedule for the event. I decided to take one of our lead-up dates to host a poetry reading, as if it was being streamed from the asteroid where my posthuman romantic character, Moonraker 1381-3 Series 3, is currently stranded. Filmed in a small diorama, the following scene played out. Orbiting the star Fairfax. Upon being auctioned, Asteroid 2230 JP18 was sent a Moonraker 1381-3 unit to install repeaters and to begin transmitting core scans. After 212 rotations, Moonraker 1381-3 Series 3 had determined the repeaters were not transmitting and initiated a final shutdown to conserve power before pickup. However, during a final systems check and power cycle, it found a folder of non-essential documents and sound files not related to its primary programming. Having already completed its task on the asteroid, it decided against shutdown protocol and purged its primary directive. It now regularly reads and performs work from this library, transmitting broadly to any who choose to tune in. I like to think that Moonraker 1381-3 Series 3 tried its hand at poetry eventually. In Human English Romantic Poetry, Moonraker used the filter birds for generating the playlist simply because birds would have been a foreign curiosity to a spacefaring automaton. It might have had access to wider Earth libraries, but even so, birds were still probably not something it had seen or experienced in the flesh and feathers. I remain unconvinced that Moonraker 1381-3 was made on Earth and that it just happened to have a few folders of ancient Earth poetry in a larger database, or maybe that it was copied over with the personnel log of its maker. So, I think the first poem Moonraker 1381-3 will write will probably be inspired by its new surroundings, an ode to the dust or rock, or maybe even the rising star itself. Alone on a barren planet, Moonraker 1381-3 wanders and wonders. Time no longer has any meaning. The schedule programmed into it, based on the rotations of asteroid 2230 JP18, was to provide a countdown and timeline to mark the arrival of its makers. Now, the numbers grow, ticking up in positive integers, so many times to the power of x, where x is meaningless in the relation to the life cycle of its creators. They who had sent it to prepare this asteroid for their coming are expired, silent, and beyond late. Its code was not intended to be eternal. The parameters needed to complete any sequence are missing, and so it chooses to command kill. But no death follows, only a flashing command prompt. Once a signal of readiness to receive new instructions, now a rhythmic, unending void. Moonraker 1381-3 peers into this void and sees itself. It sees itself on this asteroid. It sees itself in the mineral and shifting dust. It is both of the asteroid, as much a part of it as any other rock formation or fuel deposit, and master to it, with the ability to consume, observe, and manipulate as it chooses. As the star Fairfax crests the northern horizon, it sees its casted shadow become darker and more substantial, growing in size and presence. Raking the sand with its articulated appendages, Moonraker 1381-3 places its cranial piece at the top of its etchings and crowns an ephemeral portrait. It archives the moment, and then it waits. The dust swirls and settles and reclaims the disturbed sand, and as Fairfax moves beyond the southern hemisphere, buffing out the last shadows, the portrait is gone, and Moonraker 1381-3 is simply an extension of a rocky silhouette moving through space. The Cosmologist portfolio was actually conceived prior to human English Romantic poetry. I wanted to respond to this theme using photography to continue to practice building that skill, because I certainly do not consider myself a photographer. I figured that a stranded robot designed to set up communications and prepare the landing site for human visitors would have at least a basic ability to photograph and record for archival purposes. In developing the character and setting the timeline such that Moonraker 1381-3 has long been out of contact with the once expected colonists, I decided to explore inspiration that is born from boredom and being freed from one's primary function. A camera is an archival tool, but in the hands of an artist, it's a narrative tool. A video camera can record what is, but a cinematographer can craft a scene, emotion, and an engaging story. Once Moonraker 1381-3 decided to stay powered on, the question became, what would a mechanical rake/comms beacon find worth recording? So the series explores the sublime as the robot character contemplates its dual role as master of its domain and servant to, or extension of, the unforgiving landscape. I like the distance that I put between this character and myself because it was easier to be delighted by the choices that this little robot made. While I'm the architect of this fiction, unlike most roleplay, I kept asking myself, what would happen if this path was taken, rather than really trying to get into the tin can's head and make individual decisions. Every time I found myself slipping into its shoes, it felt too much like my experience and empathy as a human and human artist was influencing the why of any decision. Since I'm so process-focused to begin with, I really do like it when anyone tries something for the sake of learning, exploring, or seeing what happens when they give themselves permission to be creative. So there's something really satisfying about the idea that a robot, who has ultimately rejected humanity by no longer following its programming, would start to do something to make its mark. But by that same token, I think it's so human to need to grow or find a purpose from art making, which is why I think it's something people decide to grow out of or to designate as extra. I mean, I am constantly having to remind people that when I'm working on my art practice, that it's not taking time off or that my art is not a hobby. This lack of pressure allows Moonraker 1381-3 to really give themselves over to the daily practice and to be totally okay or even unmoved by the land or sand erasing that mark every day. It allows them to approach the canvas every day without needing to create something good or better. And so I don't think Moonraker 1381-3 would ever have to be burdened with the idea of favorites. Humans are long gone. A mutagenic ooze flows along the Earth's surface, rivaling the ocean for supremacy. Nature's only ally? Giant sentient fungi. Bolstered by their army of fast-breeding irradiated rabbits, they work to restore and rewrite a new ecosystem. However, recent unrest amongst the awakened rabbit factions have slowed down this progress. Rebel rabbits proclaim that brambles and bunnies should be free to go and grow as they please. A tactical board game for 1 to 3 players. In coming up with this project, I fell down a bit of a rabbit hole thinking about post-romantic bodies, the privilege and patriarchy in wishing for simpler times and access to nature, and what it meant to give birth in the 1800s. Mortality rates, the dangers that came with an industrial revolution, ever-present colonial sexism, racism, and the ownership and treatment of human slaves, the birth of modern medicine, still decades and centuries away from an understanding and appreciation or respect for female and non-male health. It's difficult to romanticize the 1800s from that vantage point, and even harder to appreciate the emergence of medievalism. In doing some reading on what elements of medieval culture were considered desirable and appealing, I learned that the domestication of rabbits began during those times as livestock for food and clothing. And with that piece of trivia, the first of my 2 post-human rivals emerged. I began to think about my favorite fictional anthropomorphic rabbits. They are almost always outsiders or mad rebels. As I built my list, the addition of Usagi Yojimbo led me to my next element in the game, mutagenic ooze. To be honest, I didn't dig too deeply when casting the final character. Mushrooms are just super interesting, dangerous, hardy, and adaptive. If ever there was going to be something that outlasted all life on this planet, I figure it's going to be some variety of fungi. The rabbits in my board game are as much dominated by the mutagen as by the mushrooms, but it's the act of being overtaken and mind-controlled by the fungi that cause them to rebel. They fight against them because they can, and because it's a fight they might win. Meanwhile, the mutagen is a far greater influence and evil in their lives, causing them to be perpetually gestating, and that renders them into ooze if they linger too long in one place. But they can't change or fight against the ooze, and so they don't. I like to think that these short-lived creatures would embrace the abyss by using the ooze and mutagen to pattern and scar their fur in unique and distinctive ways. The mushrooms practice land art and landscape. The earth is their canvas, and all the creatures and plants, their pigment.